This is a talk that I'm super excited about doing. Manuel Abreu is someone that I've come to know on the art side of my practice. Reached out to me several years ago around collaborating for things that I do at the Frye Art Museum, which is where I work here in Seattle as manager of public programs. And we had been trying to do this program and we had totally scheduled it for March, but then COVID-19 hit and we just realized that the best thing to do is to do it virtually, to take advantage of this technology, see if we can make it work for our purposes and have this conversation. And so I'm super excited to have this talk today with Manuel. And Manuel, I would also ask you to, actually, let me just do a few admin things. So for people who are joining on IG, the comment pinned is the link to the actual conference call. If you want to join the conference call, you can do so using that link that is pinned in the IG live. Otherwise, feel free to listen in on the IG live. And for those of you who are here on the actual conference call, I would ask that you just remain muted. And then once we start taking questions, if you want to post your question in advance in the chat, you can already do so. Otherwise, we will just try to do it as orderly as possible with you guys unmuting and doing the questions that way. We're going to try to get this going as best as we can. We are recording, so there will be a record. And that said, Manuel, please, I would love it for you to introduce yourself, tell everybody about homeschool in Portland, the programming that you've done, why you pulled that together, and then we can get right to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for doing this, Negarra. Homeschool is really honored to have you presenting this talk and engaging people on these interesting and important topics. For those who aren't aware, Homeschool is a free pop-up art school. We're currently in the 5th year of a multimedia curriculum, which focuses on creating welcoming spaces for critical engagement with contemporary art. We're interested in this idea of casual rigor and the vernacular origins of pedagogy, given the etymology of school from Greek skole, meaning leisure, idle time, rest time. So these are kind of important driving factors in the curation of different critical thinkers that we bring on. We focus specifically on Black folks. We have some other people of color as well when the time is relevant for them to give a talk. We're in our 5th year of curriculum so far. We've received a couple of Precipice Fund grants, Regional Arts and Culture Council grants, and a Rhizome Net Art Micro grant.
Wonderful.
We just finished a residency last year at Yale Union, where we deepened our engagement with screening and publication. I do the project with my friend Victoria Ann Rice. She's got experience with an alternative arts education project in New York called Bruce High Quality Foundation University. It doesn't exist anymore, but when she moved back to Oregon from New York, she didn't have any distance learning opportunities with that project. They were local focused, which is, that's their decision. So we just decided to start a project that focused on distance learning and gives people anywhere, anytime the ability to engage these ideas. And so that said, all of Homeschool's curriculum is archived at homeschoolpdx.tumblr.com, including this talk once the live stream is over. So you can head on over there and check out some wonderful talks by people, including folks that you've hosted, like Min Win, Mohose Sekukuni, as well as other folks, Arya Dean, Diamond Stingley, E. Jane, some of my favorite emerging and established artists right now.
Wonderful.
So yeah, homeschool is just an experiment for learning in public, because I'm not an artist in that sense. Like, I didn't study art. I don't have the legitimation, and I just kind of wanted to invite other people to learn with me, and it's been really fun so far. So thanks for doing this.
Good. No, my pleasure. I'm just going to make sure the volume here is turned up so everybody wherever they're tuning in can hear. IG people, are you all able to hear the conversation okay? I hope so. There shouldn't be any feedback. But any of you all who are just joining, I'm super excited to be in conversation with Manuel Abreu of Homeschool PDX, and we are going to get started. I'm going to hand it back to Manuel. I'm just here to, to be asked.
Okay, sure. Well, the reason I think this is interesting, first, it's for us, for homeschool, it's exciting to return to this kind of origin of the homeschool project, where things are just digital. We haven't done this kind of event in a long time. So I'm really honored that the return to that can be kind of fostered by you. And maybe apropos of that, we can just go into the current topic of the pandemic and this kind of telepresence and the new social distance, and how you're seeing that affect contemporary practices.
So, as a sort of first observation, particularly for artists who have a studio separate from their workspace, they are not necessarily able to go to their studio, particularly if that's a shared studio space. And in a place like Seattle that is increasingly more expensive, more than likely you are sharing a studio space with multiple people. And so because of the social distancing, you are unable to go and be in your studio space in some cases, unless you're practicing extremely severe methods, and just in terms of cleanliness and the actual distancing piece, which is not as easy as you think. I mean, humans can be solitary, but we do better together. And you soon realize how integral that interaction becomes. And so I think there's for everyone, but particularly for artists, that there's this sense of isolation and inability to carry on with their practice, which is, one thing that is certainly difficult. I would say for particularly students who are in art school, when I talk to friends of mine who are educators, what they are saying in particular is, this sense of feeling cheated. They are, no matter what year they are in their studies, they are not able to go in to the building and make. They're not able to get the same level of interactivity. I mean, the nature of contemporary art, or art period, is about engagement. And so that you cannot go in and work with your materials, or be in conversation with colleagues, or be in conversation with instructors to get that kind of vital feedback that helps one develop a practice, is extremely difficult. Not to mention just the sort of on the admin side, and sort of all of the things that go along with, completing this journey of a degree, be it graduate or undergraduate, and not being able to walk across the stage and receive accolades for these however many years of work that you've put into it. And so it's really restrictive in sort of tangible ways. I think, however, thinking intangibly, thinking more, thinking, I hate to say thinking on the bright side, but thinking more on the opportunities that this pandemic has sort of, in a way that perhaps that we were not necessarily thinking that it would. It's given us back time in a way that was unexpected. It certainly was unexpected for me. And so we always talk about, oh, well, I don't have time. I don't have time. I won't have time. Well, now, for a variety of reasons, not all positive, we have time. Unfortunately, some people have lost their jobs. Unfortunately, because of, just ongoing class realities in this country, there are essential workers, many of whom who are artists, who have had to continue to work in, conditions that, because of how this disease works, is you know, there's a level of exposure and danger to that, quite frankly, you know, because of how the disease works, because of the fact that you can be asymptomatic and be, you know, and be a carrier and not have symptoms, but give it to someone else, you know, and the general levels of stress. So, you know, on one hand, there's an opportunity because we have time, and I personally have been thinking about, okay, what am I going to do with my time? You know, obviously I have obligations to my job at the Frye, and then I obviously obligations to my business that I maintain. But, you know, what will this time afford me that, you know, just in the past, what is this, May, the past 4 months before this became a thing, that I was not able to take advantage of? How can I think about that differently? How can I leverage that? But I think also, you know, we sort of limit people to this narrow thing of, okay, they're an artist, but yes, they're an artist, but they're also a person. These are people with families, connections, all sorts of things. And so we also should not underestimate the ways in which this is having a real toll on people's capacity, their mental health, their physical health, even if they are not an essential worker and they're not, you know, out in the element. It's a different kind of challenge, but it's a challenge nonetheless, I find.
And I think on top of that, there's a sense of denial about the mourning that needs to happen. And I think that's really what's weighing on people, is this like uncertainty and denial of mourning, inability to accept that the world that most of us knew is gone. You know, this is a new concept. Like everything.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that's what I think a lot of people, myself included, are going to have to grapple with if we're not already, you know.
Right,
life as we know it is not going to be the same. I just took a look at the Governor Inslee's recommendation for this four-phase process of resuming work, and it's aggressive. It presumes people's strict adherence to the guidelines. It assumes that there are sufficient tests for any and everyone to be able to access whether they have symptoms or not. Because again, as I mentioned, individuals who are asymptomatic are potential carriers, could have it, don't know it. And if they're an essential worker, there's an increased probability that they may in fact be infecting others. And so I think this notion of contagion is an interesting one, because really and truly, I think we're going to have to assume that an event like this will become the norm.
Right.
And I'm just speculating. This is not based on anything other than, you know, just sort of what I'm thinking based on what I'm seeing. But this is going to be the norm, perhaps 2 to 3 times a decade, you know, going forward. And so how does that affect our ability to travel? How does that affect our ability to have and maintain work? You know, I think about that in relation to the art world, and the art world increasingly is based on one's ability to travel, to sell work other places, to show work other places. You know, I just look at even the engagement that Homeschool and the Frye had. You know, you guys came up to Seattle both times, you know. The first time Min was here, but you physically came, and I mean, by right, you should, because it's not just your program, but also it's that engagement, right? You want to be in conversation and share the energy of the audience that is interested in the, interested in the program. And so I think we are really going to be in for a surprise in terms of what that is going to look like. There was a post on Twitter. I recently started following CNN Switzerland specifically because of this post. They did an interview with a art dealer by the name of Dominique Levy. And Dominique Levy has a joint art gallery. They're in Switzerland, they're here in the US, in New York, they're, I believe, in Hong Kong and a few other places. And she was commenting specifically on the digital version of Art Basel. I believe it's Hong Kong. And she said categorically, unimpressed. People are not going to want to do these online digital viewing rooms in place of an art fair. And so that I thought was interesting because, as you may know, they had started talking about these online viewing rooms as some kind of alternative, right? Mm-hmm. To what at that point that they came about, I don't know. But, now they're proposing them as alternatives to the actual art fair. And she's been in the game for 20, almost 30 years at this point, was just like categorically, no, not at all. But then she went on to say, because there had been news from other fairs that had canceled their 2020 fair, that they were going to try to reschedule for Q4 of 2020. Mm-hmm. And she said, that is absolutely ridiculous. No one is going to feel comfortable coming to a fair with all of those, thousands of people that attend over the course of a weekend. They're not going to feel comfortable coming to a fair unless there's a vaccine. Mm-hmm. And at this point, while there seems to have been murmurings the past several days, increased murmurings the past several days about a vaccine, there's nothing sure about that. There's nothing certain about that. And so the point that I'm getting to is that what does a art world look like where exhibitions can't travel, artworks can't be loaned, people cannot gather for a museum exhibition or a gallery exhibition, organizations like yours that are pop-up and that are serving local communities, local and regional communities, cannot travel to these locations where they're doing partnership programs. Someone like me, who in their independent practice is often invited to speak and that sort of thing. What does that mean? It sounds a lot like some level of standstill. And the reason why I say that is because to date, I'm not yet hearing any solutions coming from any corner of the art world, myself mm-hmm. included, because I don't know that I have any other than the fact that we need to think about it, But I've not yet heard any solutions coming from any corner of the art world about how the art world could look different post-pandemic.
I've seen some interesting things. I'm skeptical about a lot of this stuff. I think institutions kind of like have their priorities mm-hmm. already set mm-hmm. and expecting them to change is mm-hmm. misguided. But for example, like PICA with the Precipice Fund, they recently converted it into COVID artist relief grants. So instead of applying for specific projects to get money for that project, any artist in financial need can apply. So this kind of thing of places that have for a long time called themselves community resources, maybe like stepping up to that title and actually providing resources. I would love to see more of that.
That I think is important, and I'm happy to see it. I've seen a few things circulating in and around Seattle mm-hmm. where that is concerned. But I think what I'm talking about is really the community aspect of it.
Okay, got it.
you know, because it's important. Artists need to be able to get funds. They should be able to have public access to public money. But even if they receive that money, and even if they are able to use that money to develop their practice and to make several bodies of work, where are they going to be able to show that work that people can actually see it?
Nowhere. Yeah.
And that's what I'm thinking about. And I'm as someone who looks at art online and off, the online experience is not preferred. Even as someone who is willing to do programs like this and wants to do more of them, it's not preferred.
No, there's something really important about tangential space.
Yes, precisely. And so I think sort of that's probably what I'm thinking about. You know, how is the art world going to have to change? Because people still want to see art, but will we be able to see it at the frequency that we want to see it? You know, like what significance do museums hold anymore if people can't safely gather at them? You know?
Yeah, I saw an interesting article in Art in America about there's this like white movement called post-internet a couple of years ago.
Okay.
And one of the post-internet artists, Artie Vierkant, he wrote an article for Art in America last week, I believe, where he was arguing that some of these kind of digital exhibition tools of post-internet might be useful to think about in this kind of dematerialized climate. I'm skeptical about this as well, but I did find it really interesting because I remember that during that moment, like 2009 to 2014, there was the sense that like it was almost like a freedom. Like you could go online and put whatever crap on there you wanted, and that was the exhibition, right? So he's kind of calling for this return to that Bacchanalia moment. I thought that was interesting. I mean, I'm skeptical, but
yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that now that people foreseeably have the time to be on the internet all day long, are they going to want to do that?
Right.
Personally, I'm finding that I don't want to be on the internet all day long. You know, because I'm at home and the separation between work and home is blurred when you work from home. And so for the amount of time that I have to be on the internet for both my jobs, once that's done, I want to not be on the internet. I want to not be looking at a screen at my computer. I look at my phone enough as it is, and I need to cut that down. I want to cut that down, not because, you know, I don't think that what I'm consuming on there is useful, but because it has real adverse impacts. For me, at least. I'm not going to comment on what it does for other people, but for me, at least, you know, there was a period of time where I was experiencing extreme eye strain, extreme headaches and fatigue from just being on the internet, looking at a screen all the time, you know, and when I started to reduce that, I started to feel better. And so, you know, for all the solutions that we pose, for all the virtual solutions that we pose, we also have to consider the fact that not everybody wants to consume content that way. You know, a friend of mine, I posted a book that on my Instagram on Friday that I just got. And when she saw that I posted the book, she said, "Oh, well, why didn't you just tell me? I could have scanned it and sent it to you." And so I was just like, well, you know, I like books and I'm sick of looking on screens. I'm sick of looking at screens. And so that's where I'm at. I'm imagining that there are several other people who are like in that space as well. And so what do we do when our only opportunity then to consume art and to consume discourse, public discourse, is on a screen that we don't really want to look at anymore? You know?
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think the loss of tangible space and the kind of like when I'm reading online, the comprehension is way lower. When I'm seeing things online, I'm paying less attention, you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's not preferred, like you're saying. I totally agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's one alternative that someone was mentioning. I was
Mm-hmm.
wondering if you could speak about what role spirituality might play in this context. I see a lot of people turning to that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
always just skeptical about things, but I am seeing that kind of return. I think a lot of people get desperate and kind of turn
Mm-hmm.
to times, maybe
Mm-hmm.
inauthentically, but that's okay too.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. As in any area, as in any discipline, as in any industry, there are the people who are generally seeking some level of support that they think this thing can provide. And then there are people who are seeking the veneer of that because they're more interested in what sort of the image is that they portray. And so they want the image of being healed and the image of being spiritual. And then there are people who are simply seeking to profit off of it. And so the healing industry and certainly spirituality, spiritual communities, specifically non-Abrahamic spiritual traditions and communities are no less susceptible to that.
Mm-hmm.
I have been involved in African rooted spiritual traditions for the past 15 years, 15 or 17, depending on how you count. And concurrent with the internet, you have seen an increase in participation. And some of that participation is about genuine healing. Other of that participation is what I described before. Someone on Instagram just said internet is a bridge, not the arrival point, and that's precisely it. And so I think that no matter how people's engagement ends up being, I think there's a curiosity there. I think there's a base level curiosity there because there is, I do believe that within most people, unless you're just talking about somebody who's a sociopath or a psychopath, but within most people, there is a desire to figure out something. There is a desire to tap into a source that is unknown, but that they can feel even if they can't see and hear, and that is bigger than themselves, and that can provide a can provide a sense of support, succor, joy, assistance, but I think once people get in it and start to look at it through really and truly the only lens that we, particularly as people in the United States, have. Most of us generally sort of default to this Western capitalist informed lens. It becomes about what they can do with it or how they can use it, not per se for themselves to heal themselves, but for other self-interested, self-aggrandizing purposes. Lauren asks a really, really good question.
Yeah,
I'm going to read this out loud because I think it's worth pausing to consider this. Do you think that there is a way this can be leveraged as an opportunity to address some of the current barriers to entry in the art world? For example, not everyone can make it to something like an art basel, and if they can, they may not be able to showcase their work. Could this be used as a moment to make the art world more accessible to folks who currently find it challenging to navigate? I'd like to think so. Lauren. The difficulty that even I have with envisioning that is, if our movement is restricted in a quote unquote post-pandemic world, and we can look forward to having repeat cycles like this. And again, my feeling is 2 to 3 times a decade, we can look at having repeat cycles like this. And, we're in the United States, we are in various places, are in various stages of it. The reality is that if the states reopen everything too quickly, there will be a second, probably significantly harsher upswing of COVID-19 come late summer, fall. And so that means that overall recovery is going to be much slower. We're probably looking at recovery that won't really start to look like any improvement until 2021. Because as a friend of mine says, it is easy to turn the car off, but after the car has been off for a year, year and a half, almost 2 years, turning it back on, you better hope that your engine is still okay. You better hope that your transmission is all right. You better hope that your brakes still work. You know? And so it's hard for me to imagine navigating anything when we don't have movement, because all of this is predicated on people moving and art moving. You know, if you as a new artist, an emerging artist, is offered a show, you are based in Atlanta, if I remember correctly, and you're offered a show in Seattle. In order for that show to happen, the museum or the gallery that is showing your work has to organize getting your work from Atlanta to Seattle. That takes, if you do it on the cheap end, you're using UPS or FedEx, but that still takes workers who are going to make sure that that package gets there. That also takes, you know, a significant amount of money. Shipping art is not cheap. Yeah. Then there's the question of install. So there's the team at the gallery or the museum that has to install your work. How do you do social distancing when you need minimally to do an efficient install in a museum? You need minimally 10 to 15 people to get that done. And the museum that I work for is a small museum. It's not, you know, it's not a large museum like the Met or even the High Museum in Atlanta. Then ideally they should be flying you out to come talk about your work. And so I think it's hard to imagine because our solutions are predicated on being able to move, and we don't know how soon we're going to be able to move around. Also consider the fact that these airlines, the airline industry is, excuse my language, is fucked. You know? And so forget about going to an art exhibition. How are we, for those of us who live in different places in our families, how are we getting to see our families? You know, even the notion of a car trip is wild right now, because if you want to do a road trip from, and I live in Chicago, I'm from Chicago, live in Seattle. If I want to do a road trip from Seattle to Chicago, I got to think about where am I going to be able to stay along the way? And if hotels and all of those things are closed, where am I staying? That's a 42, 45-hour drive, you know? And so I'd like to think that we could think about that, but so everything that we do in the art world is about movement and transportation and people moving and art moving and money moving. Now, the one thing that can and still continues to move, particularly in sort of the higher echelons of the commercial art market, is money. You don't necessarily need a gallery show to be able to sell art, particularly for established collectors that know what they want and have connections to be able to get them. Where this becomes difficult is for emerging artists in emerging galleries who are not necessarily known quantities yet, may not have had their first museum show, their first solo exhibition at a museum or similar kinds of art organization. And so they are presumably at a disadvantage unless they just have an aggressive art dealer that knows how to market, knows how to sell. And some of them do, but not all of them do, you know? And so I want to say yes, it's just hard for me to imagine at this point when we are not able to safely move, when we're not able to safely travel. But it's an excellent question, and we absolutely should be thinking about that once we have less restriction. We absolutely should think about that once we have less restriction.
Yeah, I think it's going to be difficult to convince institutions that the honoraria they pay for, let's say, an exhibition or a commission performance, for it to stay the same in a virtual context. It's going to be a really hard conversation to have. I've already been engaging that, and they are reticent, to say the least. They're not.
Well, what has your experience been with
They
that?
don't
Like,
see
what is some of the commentary, if you can share?
Yeah, absolutely. They don't see the value of, for example, let's say you're being paid, I don't know, 2,000 to do an exhibition at a small institution or a small project space. They don't feel that the online iteration of that project is worth the same value, even though from the perspective of the artist, the labor is the same.
Mm-hmm.
I might not be traveling to this space, and I might not be physically helping with install. Um, in the let's say in this hypothetical scenario, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
But the labor from my perspective is still the same. I'm still doing the same amount of work, so I get
Mm-hmm.
the same payment.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I've
Mm-hmm.
already seen pushback from institutions and project spaces
Mm-hmm.
who, in their own right, I guess maybe are struggling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but there's been a resistance toward labor being treated or valued the same on the digital landscape.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. I mean, it's going to bring up so many issues. I mean, money is sort of the undercurrent to all of this.
Mhm.
Um, and that's a conversation we do need to have, regardless of whether we resume some level of normalcy or not. There does need to be a conversation around money in the art world, particularly in nonprofit spaces.
Mm.
But I don't know. I wonder if it's still too early to tell. Like I feel like all I'm capable of doing really is speculating. A lot of the opportunities that I've been offered in my independent practice have come simply through my being my showing up. And you can't show up in a pandemic. There's nothing to show up to, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. There's
nothing to show up to. So we're going to see. But back to the original question, which is, spirituality. I think it's healthy to be skeptical because you can't trust everybody, nor should you. There needs to be a level of discernment about who it is that you are going to engage with, particularly if you are seeking some level of help. I recently did a talk on IG Live talking about how to find the right spiritual practitioner for you. And that's on my YouTube channel that people can easily find through my website. And I'll put it in the chat box before the conversation ends. But, if that is something that you're seeking, the best advice that I can give anybody is to be discerning. Like if you see something or you see someone and what they're saying sounds too good to be true, it may very well be. Or if you see something or see someone and you feel like it is, it doesn't hit right, it doesn't feel right, then follow that. You should definitely, by all means, follow that. Mm-hmm. I think it can be I think like anything else, it can be a good thing when you find the right person or group of people to support you, but it can be as negative and as traumatic as, many of the experiences people have had with Abrahamic religions. If you find someone who's just a straight up, charlatan, sociopath, psychopath, they exist in non-Abrahamic traditions as well. They totally do. And in fact, many of them are able to hide in these traditions because people have this sense of, if you are in an African or African rooted tradition, you must have some level of consciousness. Mm-hmm. Not always. One would think, but not always. So.
I was wondering maybe if you could speak more about this idea of spiritual hygiene in the context of community building, whether it's seeking out a spiritual leader or building an art community or any kind of work that involves engaging socially. I'm interested
Right.
in
Okay.
the
For
context.
sure. I think so. Spiritual hygiene, I certainly will not claim it as my own, but it's certainly a term that I have been using increasingly since end of last year because my experience with my one-on-one clients was so intense in terms of me just observing what it is that they were dealing with and what it is that they were going through, that it became clear to me that people did not have a baseline. There were people who were genuinely interested in spirituality and using it for their healing, but they did not have a baseline of knowledge on how to go about that. And so I put together an ebook. And then subsequently I developed a one-on-one offering, but also a community offering, to just help people beef up their knowledge, give them some concrete training, and exercises that they could leverage in their own practice. And so in doing that, I've really been able to get a firmer sense of what people do and do not know and what people are actually interested in. Now, when applied to broader communities, it would be my hope that as for those of us who do turn to spirituality and healing as ways to get ourselves together, but also form community around shared ideals, it has to be more than just the talk. We need to really just be interested also as much in the doing, which is why, again, I decided to put together these services so that people would be able to have a reference tool of some things that actually work. Now, in my independent practice, I have been very fortunate because no matter how often I start to think like, oh, Negarra, this whole healing art thing, that sounds a little crazy, who actually is really into that, then I meet hella people who are like, that's spot on. I think the practice is interesting. I've thought about this. I want to know more, like, how do you do it? And then I meet artists who, in their artwork, you see the spirituality, you see the spiritual piece, you see the visual narrative and discourse around healing. And so it is instances like that I am reminded that what I decided to do, what I was led to do, actually does work and does make sense. Also, as you know, as a person of African descent, and as that comes from several African cultures, art is not separate from spirituality. That is the case with indigenous folks the world over. I'd like to think that in pre-Christian Europe, when Europeans still had their own indigenous cultures, that there was some semblance of that idea too. But I don't know because I've not read that history. But certainly within African rooted cultures, African cultures, there is not the separation between art and healing or spirituality. Some of the most gorgeous, aesthetically rigorous, pleasing works, many of whom are in, museums in Europe, museums in the United States, and have been there for hundreds of years because of the colonial experiment and how a large part of that involved taking ancient texts, taking, artwork and all of that. It's just so beautiful. They really and truly are beautiful, but they were also functional.
Yep.
And so one of the more famous pieces that most people will be familiar with coming out of Bantu traditions are what they call the Nkisi Nkondi. Those are what anthropologists refer to as nail fetishes. The proper name is Nkisi Nkondi. And it is a vessel that houses a specific spirit for a specific purpose, generally for the purpose of achieving justice in situations where people have been wronged. Mm-hmm. And those pieces are actually absolutely gorgeous and stunning. I'm only 5'3". Some of them are half my height. But they imbibe a specific aesthetic that's very powerful to mimic the function that they're supposed to take on. But also the production was a community affair, And so you had the sculptor, you had the master wood sculptor who made the piece. You have the diviner that was the one who determined that said piece needed to exist to begin with. And then oftentimes you had a third spiritualist who was the person who ritually consecrated it, because at least where the Bantu traditions that contributed to Palo Mayombe, which is what I practice in Ashley, I will answer that question. We haven't discussed it yet. There were different kinds of spiritualists, and those functions were separate on the African continent. Mm-hmm. They became one once Africans ended up in the diaspora. That this is why you have, in many priesthoods, you have an individual who's a diviner, a medicine, what in Spanish-speaking cultures you call curandera or curandero, who's a diviner, a curandero, also someone who builds vessels, literally like the sculptor or the builder, those used to be separate functions. And so you have minimally 3 people who are involved in the making of this object. One responsible for determining what the function is going to be, one responsible for the aesthetic of it, and making sure the aesthetic serves the function. Mm-hmm. And making sure that at which point it is consecrated to carry out that function, that the aesthetic lets people know exactly what this is, so it makes it identifiable. And then the actual spiritualists who consecrated it. So by nature, our items, our objects are beautiful, are functional, but are also communal. Mm-hmm. And hold on, I'm just letting somebody else in. I just lost my train of thought. Remind me of the previous part of the question.
We were talking about Nkisi Nkondo and functionality and spirituality as distinct from autonomous art.
Right. And so, yeah, I really just wanted to use that as an example of, sort of the differences. I'm trying to remember what your original question was, just in terms of spirituality and community and all of that.
Spiritual hygiene and community.
Spiritual hygiene. Okay. Well. So when I think about that process, when I think about that process, and I think about what I still do as a part of my Palo Mayombe lineage, community is inherent. Mm-hmm. no matter which way you start, whether you start with the community and end up with spirituality, or whether you start with spirituality and you end up with the community. It's inherent. The question for me, looking at how things are moving and how we need to move forward as spiritual communities, but also as artistic communities, is how do we heighten the level of care, and how do we heighten the level of vigilance? How I know how to do that is through being a priestess who can divine. You know, oftentimes when my clients come to me and they come to me with specific issues, what they're really asking me to do is see. They want me to look at their situation and give an assessment via divination, using divination as the tool, whether it's me using my mediumship abilities or me actually throwing the implement. Now, when people come to me, when artists, when institutions come to me and ask me, Negarra, we would like to commission you to write an essay on this artist's artwork, they're also asking me to see. They're asking me to look at this body of work, look at this exhibition, look at the existing record, if there is one, and give my way, give my view through the forest, to quote one of my lineage elders, Tata Ernesto Mercer. You know, give my view through the forest, give the context that I offer. And so for me, that's why it's this crossroads practice is really the flip side of the same coin. There is no separation for me. You know, I need to start telling people that I'm a professional seer. I just look at things for a living, because that's really what I feel like I do. Like, I look at art, I look at people, I come up with solutions in the form of ideas that I offer to people. Now, clearly the methodology is different, but that's, you know, that's essentially what I do. And I think going forward, we need to get back to the question where particularly where spiritual hygiene is concerned. Going forward, we need to be willing to see and be seen. Because if we're really thinking about community and building community and reinforcing ourselves through community and using spiritual hygiene as but one tool to do so, we need to be willing to be seen, and we need to be willing to see. And that's a very vulnerable position to be put in for many people, because for many people of color, many LGBTQ individuals, their existence, their safe existence in this world as we know it, is predicated on their invisibility. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily like that, but I know it to be true. You know, if you can't be seen, there is a level of safety, however, you know, basic that might be. But for some people, that's the thing. They don't like to be seen. They don't like to be seen, or being seen, it constitutes an unsafe environment for them. But I think if we're really talking about community, and we're really talking about community, viable community, that it provides safe spaces for people to be, safe spaces for people to think and commune around ideas of art and spirituality, whether together or separate, mm-hmm. then we really need to have some conversations about what it means to see, and what it means to be seen. And how perhaps there needs to be a willingness to implicate ourselves in what that means. Because I think a lot of human resistance to change comes because people do not necessarily want to implicate themselves in the issue. You know, the reality is we can all, you know, curse down, chant down capitalism until our eyes roll back. But the reality is that we all have an internet bill that we pay. I have a 2 social sciences degree, a bachelor's in Latin American studies and a bachelor's in Latin American studies and a master's degree in international relations and diplomacy. And so, as I said, I am by training, I am a social scientist. I have never called myself an art historian. I refer to myself probably over the past 4 years, I've started referring to myself as an independent scholar, primarily because since I entered the art world in 2014, I've made it my business to starting over. My undergraduate and graduate education is in Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies, bachelor's degree, and then a master's of international relations and diplomacy, graduate degree. And so I am a trained social scientist. I have recently started calling myself a independent scholar, and that is because over the past since 2014, when I formally entered the art world and formally entered museums, I recently started calling myself an independent scholar as of probably about 2016, when I did my first conference, because I took it upon myself to self-educate myself where contemporary art was concerned. And that involved a lot of conversations with artists, a lot of conversations with curators as often as I could, gallery owners in Seattle that I was friends with, but as well reading a lot of the historical canon on my own, where contemporary art was concerned. And so that being the case, that is how I've come to be fluent where contemporary art is concerned. So I've taken upon myself to continue engaging with scholarship, engaging with artists, engaging with curators, people who have a level of formal training that I do not, to help boost my own knowledge base. Where healing is concerned, I have been a part of African rooted traditions for the past 15 years. I started off and am still a part of a Lukumi community that was based in New York. And I then joined a separate Palo Mayombe community that was at the time also based in New York, and was initiated into a Palo Mayombe community. And so where the learning is concerned on the Palo side, it's been similar in certain ways. I mean, Palo is still, the communities that I'm familiar with still do sort of old fashioned, you have to sit with your godparent, learn by watching and doing. There's only but so much you can learn from books. Palo and many of these African rooted traditions are our secret societies, and are still remain as such in many ways, if not 100%. And so the way to learn is if you have been welcomed in that community and you adhere to the guidelines and protocols of that community, and you learn at the foot of your godparent primarily, and then secondarily, elder god siblings. In terms of scholarship that pertains to Palo Mayombe, the stuff that is available talks about the African peoples from Central and West Central Africa that contributed to what we know as Palo Mayombe. Just for the sake of clarity, Palo Mayombe, though it very clearly has African roots, it is a Cuban tradition, specifically an Afro-Cuban tradition. It was created and developed and maintained on the island of Cuba by Black people who came from various regions of Central and West Central Africa. And so it's wholly Cuban. There are some similarities to spiritual practice that still happen in those in that West Central African region in Africa, but those traditions are distinct from what we do, and we are distinct from what they do. And that's important to I think that's important to note, because history and all of those things has its own effect on these traditions and how they move and how they worked. And so a lot of what I do now as a part of my spiritual practice does include a scholarship element. I am trying to get back into a habit of regular reading of historical documents, historical texts, books by scholars who have been focused on the spiritual traditions of that region, just to support what it is that I see in my day-to-day practice, what it is that I know about Palo Mayombe. And just to give added context and added perspective. And so that's how I came to my practice. Apologies for that long-winded response, but clearly. I'm
good to know going
stay
forward
on for a little longer and answer some people's questions.
Okay, I'll open it up to the audience in case anyone has any.
Please.
And you all can go ahead and go on mic or type whatever you want.
So the link that Manuel posted is the link to my spiritual hygiene ebook. And it is a book that I developed at the end of last year. So just after Thanksgiving is when it came out. And I developed it as a result of seeing what was going on with many of my clients. And a lot of what they were experiencing, aside from some of the like bigger, major, sort of more generational things that they were dealing with, a lot of what they experienced, or what they were experiencing, was was compounded as a result of not having a firmly rooted practice, or wanting to achieve a firmly rooted practice, but not necessarily knowing how to go about that. And not necessarily having the level of knowledge that they needed to assist them in that. And so that is why I came out with that book, that ebook, and that is also the inspiration for the two services that I developed, which was Spiritual Hygiene One-on-One Mentorship Program and the Spiritual Hygiene Member Circle. And, I am very thankful to all of the individuals that that I am currently working with on that project, because it's really been a fruitful endeavor for me. It is a learning process when you are putting yourself in front of someone to teach, even if it's material that you know very well. And so I've been very grateful and have learned a lot already from the individuals with whom I'm working for that. Another quick note, the inspiration for my ebook came as a result of an ebook by another practitioner who I am close with, a woman by the name of Satara Troutman, who's actually on this call. And if you don't know about Satara, you should definitely learn more about her practice. She is someone else who has a crossroads practice. She is operating both as a musician and a singer-songwriter, but also as a spiritualist. She is what is known as a conjure doctor, or two-headed doctor in the African American hoodoo conjure tradition. Anyway, she she produced and still has on sale an ebook that launched, I think, about 1 or 2 months before mine did. And hers was the inspiration for mine. She talks about ancestor veneration and mediumship and the importance of those, and offers some practical tips. And so I came up with mine inspired by hers, and really and truly the two of them are sort of the flip side of the same coin. And so I would highly advise for any individual who is seeking more of that kind of information to look also at Satara's ebook. And I'm going to pull up her website so that you can take a look at that as well.
Hey y'all, I'm Satara. Nice to meet you, Negarra. Thank you for the shout out.
Of course.
I am a huge fan of Negarra's ebook, and yes, I have one. So thank you for linking it. And
Yeah, of course.
And I love you guys.
Okay. Any other questions that anybody would like to pose? Before we end, feel free to come off mute or to just type it in the chat box. Anyone?
I have a question.
Okay, Lauren.
Lauren, you used the word, and talking about Satara, you used the word crossroad. And I'm assuming for both of you, there's an intersection between what you do career-wise and also your spiritual practice. And merging the two, can you give any tips of like what that journey has kind of looked like in being able to merge your kind of career side with your spiritual practice?
So in my case, thank you, Lauren. That's an excellent question. In my case, my spiritual practice took on a different dimension, at which point I started my business, which is Negarra A, Kudumu Art and Healing. So my spiritual practice has a side that is only for me. It's about the work that I do for myself. But then as a part of Negarra A, Kudumu Art and Healing, it is a practice that serves the public in varying ways and intersects with my art practice that also serves the public in varying ways. And so at which point I started my business, I added another dimension to my spiritual practice such that it was no longer me just serving myself. It became intentionally external facing, working with clients to support them in the ways that I had seen progress in supporting myself. And similarly with the art practice, it was a way for me to be an artist advocate, to be an art advocate, and to support artists who started off primarily as just my friends who are, really amazing artists, a way to support them with writing, with research, with public discourse. And so for me, again, the crossroads element, the crossroads is a big deal in most African rooted traditions, whether it's overtly named or whether it's a subtle reference. The crossroads is sort of the intersection of the mundane world and the spiritual world. And so art has you in a public facing role in a way that spirituality and healing never will. But by me consciously choosing to engage with clients on a one-on-one basis, but also engage with publics about these traditions in primarily scholarly surroundings, that's sort of where the crossroads started to happen. I am, and if any of you all have heard me speak in different forums or have heard me speak on IG, I'm very strict about the things that I will and will not share. Because Palo Mayombe is a secret society and continues to conduct itself as such, the public information that I speak about is limited to stuff that is generally known and can be found in any of sort of the existing scholarship. I don't talk about ceremony. I don't talk about rituals. I don't talk about you sort of super personal issues that would pertain to or benefit from a divination of sorts. But for me, it was when I decided to add that public component to my spiritual practice. So rather than just focusing on myself, looking at the ways in which I could actually serve a community. As I was saying earlier on the previous video, I was pretty, skeptical of whether it would make sense. But every time that I sort of start to wonder if I'm on the right path, I meet an artist who has some, pretty profound spiritual aspects to their work, or I meet someone in the is a spiritualist and has been working as a spiritualist for quite some time, who has a private practice, who is just emerging into, I should say, who's just emerging into their artistic practice, or wants to take their practice up several notches. And so it's been a series of pleasant surprises. I think the big thing for me, what I decided, was that I was not going to truncate myself anymore. And so I don't introduce myself as a Yayi Nkisi Malongo or as a independent scholar of contemporary art. I introduce myself as all of it, because that's what you're getting when you get Negarra. That's what you're getting. You know, you're going to get the multidisciplinarity that I bring to it, because I'm a trained social scientist. You're going to get, a hell of a lot of Palo and those African diasporic traditions. And you're going to get a perspective on art, contemporary art, particularly where it relates to African contemporary art and African diasporic contemporary art. I'm fortunate to have run in a community of people in Seattle, but also in Canada, who are coming from other backgrounds, other than exclusively African or African American one. And so I've been able to have some really interesting and some profound conversations with individuals from South Asia and certain Native American individuals, and really just thinking about, how they produce and why they produce and what moves and drives them, and seeing the differences, which is refreshing, but also seeing the similarities. These happen to be individuals whose work I've written about, and they quite thankfully continue to ask me to write about their work, because even though I may be looking at it through a Bantu, a Palo Mayombe lens, it reflects and it resonates in ways that are important for them, and that they find value in. And so I'm very grateful and very thankful for that. But I think I wouldn't have been able to achieve that actual crossroads in a visible sense, if I hadn't just gone out there and said, okay, this is who I am. This is who y'all are getting, this is who you're going to get. So that's how it sort of developed for me, Lauren. I hope that answers the question.
It did. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? I don't want to hold you guys for too long. You all have been very patient with all the things that have been going on in this program today. Any last questions?
Well, I just kind of wanted to say something, because you said so many really brilliant things, and so I was like chewing
Thank you.
It was when you were like, oh, well, I see for a living, like really what people ask me to do is see. I often think about that in terms of my work, and like seeing you do Negarra was for me one of the first times, aside from like traditional practice, because Negarra talked a little bit about me, but I came from a Hoodoo spiritualist household. So a lot of people are kind of coming back to Hoodoo, which I think is beautiful. There is like this kind of remembrance that's happening, and it's happening through social media, which is interesting for me to see. But I grew up in a house where like music, I'm a musician. So music is a part of what we do. Like you cannot clean a house on Sunday without playing your music. There are things that go in ritual service. But seeing you do it publicly facing was for me like, okay, that is someone doing in alignment with what I see. And I'm really interested, like you said, there are more people that I keep coming across who stand at this crossroads or stand at this intersection of art and healing, or spiritual work and healing. And I just think that the first part to remember, and that I've been chewing on, is like, I'm a medium. So whether I am on stage, there are certain situations that I put together where like people ask me to channel, whether that's spirits, whether that is what's happening in the music. And so there's all the preparation that goes into that. I think that we look at the spiritual and the secular as separate, and they exist together all the time. And so I'm really excited about what I'm seeing in terms of how diasporic traditions are coming back to the core of that. It really are traditions that require you to engage in that crossroads space across your entire life, not just like, oh, church is on Sunday.
Yep.
And then we're done with church on Sunday. Like they present themselves in all of the formats.
Yep.
So this has been really an interesting conversation. I think it was a really good question, Lauren, because I know for myself as an artist, I am consistently figuring out in what ways they intersect. Like every moment I'm like, oh, and also this needs to be here, and realizing that like spirit has to be in all of the things that I do is a very interesting thing. And so Negarra, you are setting such like a wonderful kind of blueprint for that, or like a way that other artists can look and see and really be like, oh yeah. And it is about not truncating yourself. And the implications that come with that when you're working in diasporic practice, to not truncate yourself intentionally, because people are like, wait, you do what?
Right. And it's also weird because, you know, people want the juju, but then they're just like, too much juju.
Yeah, they want the juju, and then they're like, that's a lot. And then they don't
like from you. Back up on the juju. I didn't want that much juju.
I just want the function.
Right. You didn't want to hire, you shouldn't have hired me though then. Girl, I'm on the internet. Read. You know?
Exactly.
Thank you, Sakara. I appreciate that.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you. Any last questions before we wrap up? Anyone? Okay.
Thank you again, Negarra. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you. And thank you to everybody on Instagram, but also here on our Hangouts